Having the ability to save your progress in a game is a great feature, giving you the ability to pick up your game at a later time and continue on your quest. Many of our favorite retro games had this awesome feature and relied on a small battery in order to work. However, as some of these games approach 20 or even 30 plus years old, they will inevitably begin to fail. With that, in today's episode, I'm going to go over how to check to see if your battery needs to be replaced, as well as how to replace almost any save battery for your cartridge-based games. Let's take a look. Hey everyone, how's it going? My name is Tito and welcome to another episode of Retro Renew. Today I'm going to show you just how easy it is to replace the save battery for your retro games. There are many consoles that had games with the ability to save built into the cartridge, such as the Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, Nintendo Entertainment System, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, and the Nintendo 64, just to name a few. So what does this battery actually do? Well, to put it simply, the battery keeps the volatile memory, known as static RAM, for your game cart powered at all times, even when the console is turned off. This constant voltage allows your save data to remain intact. Once the voltage drops below a certain threshold, your save data will be lost and you will lose the ability to save your games. Alright, so now that we know what the battery actually does and why it's important, I'm going to start off by showing you all the tools and parts you'll need to test and change the battery. Then I will show you how to test the battery to see if it actually needs to be changed. And lastly, I'll show you how to change the battery on a couple different cartridges. To get started, let's go over the tools you'll need. First thing you'll need is a basic multimeter. We're going to use this to measure the voltage of the battery. Depending on the voltage reading, this will tell us if we need to replace the battery or not. It's good to test the battery first because we don't want to waste time, effort, and resources on a battery that's in good condition. Next, you'll of course need a soldering iron, both to remove the old battery and install the new one. Now this here is a Hakko 951, but any basic soldering irons such as this Goot PX201 will work just fine. These are both quality soldering irons that are made in Japan, so they will last you a good long time.
All the best stuff is made in Japan.
Unbelievable.
To go with the soldering iron, you will need a desoldering pump, solder wick, or a desoldering gun, like this Hakko FR301. But something like this is a little overkill and is totally optional. The desoldering pump will work just fine, and that's what I'll be using in this demonstration. Having any of these desoldering tools will make this process cleaner and easier. To help with the removal of this battery, having a good set of plastic spudgers or non-conductive tweezers is a good idea. Please keep in mind, since we are handling a battery that has both the positive and negative terminals so close to each other, we need to pay extra attention to ensure we don't cause a short. This is why when removing the battery, we want to be cognizant of the tools we're using, and the reason I'm stressing the use of plastic non-conductive tools for this process. Tools such as this metal spudger or these metal tweezers should not be used for this repair if you can avoid it. For the installation of the new battery, you'll need some solder and of course some flux. I'm using leaded 6337 Kester solder and this SRA flux pen. Now, in order to open the cartridge itself, you'll need a screwdriver and a gaming bit. Most Nintendo cartridges use the 3.8mm game bit, but some may use a Phillips or JIS bit, so be sure to check your cartridge ahead of time. And of course, the last thing you'll need are the batteries themselves. Since I'll be changing the battery on multiple consoles, the battery size will differ. The Game Boy and Game Boy Color will generally need either a CR1616 or CR2025 battery. For home-based consoles such as the NES, the SNES, and the Nintendo 64, a CR2032 battery is generally used. It's always good practice to check the cartridge battery first before attempting the repair. The last thing to consider when buying a battery is to ensure they are tabbed. Please do not attempt to reuse the tabs from the old battery we will be replacing. I've seen some videos and online tutorials that attempt this, and it can be both unsafe and unreliable. Buying pre-tab batteries is inexpensive and you'll get the job done right the first time. I bought this assortment of tab batteries on eBay for a relatively good price, and I can replace the batteries on many of my games. If you're interested in any of the tools or parts I've shown here, I'll have links to everything in the description below. Alright, so now that we have everything we need for this repair, let's discuss how to go about testing the battery voltage. Okay, so before we begin replacing the battery, the first thing we need to do is test the battery voltage. I'll be demonstrating this on my copy of Zelda Link's Awakening, which hasn't been able to hold a save for quite some time. So grab your screwdriver, and in this case I'll be using the 3.8mm game bit, and remove the screw on the back of the cartridge. Slide the front shell down, then lift up to remove it, exposing the game PCB. You can now see the battery on the top right quadrant of the PCB, and based on the labeling, it's a CR1616 with the positive terminal on the left and the negative terminal on the right, denoted by the positive and negative sign respectively. So my multimeter has a battery test function, and since we're dealing with relative low voltage, turn the dial to 1.5 volt test. Grab both your multimeter probes and place the red probe to the positive and black to the negative. But as you can see, this battery is showing a reading of about 141 millivolts, or 0.141 volts. This is way below the required voltage needed by the volatile memory in order to retain save data. Now let's compare that to the voltage of a brand new battery. So this reads about 3.3 volts, which is fantastic and exactly what we're looking for. Generally speaking, any battery below 2.8 or 2.9 volts should probably be replaced. So I have a pile of games here that I need to check, so I'm going to go ahead and do that first, then we'll get started with replacing them. Now, before we get started, as a word of caution, by doing this procedure, you will lose your save data. There are a few ways to preserve your data. The best way, in my opinion, would be using a ROM dumper. The only bad thing is you'll need one for each console, which can actually get quite pricey. Another way is you can attach another 3-volt battery in parallel while replacing your old one, but there's a small risk you could actually still lose the data if done incorrectly. There are other videos on YouTube that discuss how to do this, but if this is something you'd like to see me make a video on, let me know in the comments below. Okay, with all that out of the way, let's get started. So I'll be demonstrating how to replace the battery on a Game Boy and a Nintendo Entertainment System cartridge. The procedure for replacing the Game Boy battery will be very similar to the Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance, while the procedure for the NES will be very similar to the SNES and Nintendo 64. Great, let's start with the Game Boy. Now, like I said, this will be extremely similar to the process for replacing the battery on the Game Boy Color and the Game Boy Advance. They all use surface-mounted batteries. Of course, to start, remove the rear screw and then remove the cover. Then let's take out the PCB. I'm going to secure it to my PCB holder to make removing the battery easier. In this case, the terminals are labeled very clearly, but there are some cases where they aren't, so in those cases make sure to take a picture to remember how the old battery is oriented for future reference. It's important that we do not mix up the polarity of the battery. Let's go ahead and reflow some solder in there to make it easier to remove. Now with your solder sucker or solder wick, go ahead and remove as much solder as possible. Here I'm using a manual solder sucker. Next, place your non-conductive spudger or tweezers below the battery, exerting just a little prying force outward while we reheat the battery solder tabs. Having the PCB holder is really helpful for this. Great, with the one side fully removed, go ahead and do the same with the other. Fantastic, the battery is now removed. With some isopropyl alcohol, go ahead and clean the solder pads and the surrounding area. And while we have the PCB removed, let's give the contacts a good clean as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and solder in the new battery. To do this, use your flux pen to place some flux on the pads. Place the battery onto the solder pads, ensuring you have the polarity correct, positive to positive and negative to negative. Now place some more flux onto the leads and solder them in place. That's it, you've successfully replaced the battery on your Game Boy Cart. Now I'll demonstrate this on an NES cartridge, which should be very similar to the Super NES and the Nintendo 64 cartridges. The only difference between these home-based consoles and the handheld ones are that the batteries are through-hole as opposed to surface-mounted. So there you have it. You now know how to change the save battery and the majority of cartridge-based games, and you're set for years to come. This is a great way to get some experience with soldering if you're new to the hobby, and preserve and extend the life of your cartridge-based games that have save capability. Now, lastly, remember to responsibly dispose of your old lithium batteries by checking with your local municipality for the nearest electronic recycling center. These batteries are pretty toxic, so it's good practice to make sure they are disposed of appropriately. I hope you did enjoy this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Macho Nacho Productions. I release content every Thursday, so be sure to turn on notifications. And as always, we'll see you next time.